All right, so thanks for that great introduction. And as you guys know, here on FoodTech21, we're really diving into not only operational technology, but food tech innovations that are happening. And one of the topics is alternative proteins. It's one of the biggest movers in the industry, whether you're in retail food service or in the restaurant industry. There's just a plethora of new alternative and plant-based proteins out there. And we decided to get an expert with me, Alison Rabschnuk, who is the Director of Corporate Engagement of Good Food Institute. And she's joining me today right here on the session. So welcome to the session, Alison.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, so for those who are not aware of the Good Food Institute, let's kind of get them educated, brought up to speed, because you guys do a lot of different things as it relates not only to the Institute, it's the industry of food, but also in the area of technology, innovation, thing of that nature. Kind of talk to us about where you guys are going.
Sure. So for anyone who's not familiar with the Good Food Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We have about 100 staff. Many of us are headquartered here in the United States, but we also have offices in 5 overseas countries as well. And really the key question that we're trying to address is how will we feed 10 billion people by 2050 in a way that is sustainable, efficient, and safe? So from a sustainability perspective, as you may know, animal agriculture is one of the top causes of some of the most pressing environmental issues, such as water and air pollution, land use, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. Obviously, we have a lot of issues such as antibiotic resistance as well. And animal agriculture is also a very inefficient process of developing protein. So although about 3/4 of agricultural land is used for raising and feeding livestock, it actually only provides about 1/3 of the global protein supply. So at GFI, our thesis is that creating meat, eggs, and dairy from plant ingredients, cultivating them directly from cells, or producing them using fermentation science is actually the more sustainable and efficient way to give consumers the foods they love. So as an organization, we are accelerating this transition to alternative proteins by helping companies make products that are delicious, affordable, and accessible.
You mentioned by 2050 being able to get to the point of being able to feed the planet in some new and alternative methods. That's 30 years from now. If you look back 30 years from here, here we are in 2020, and I mean, that's not too long ago, and it doesn't appear in the industry that we've seen much change in that 30 years. Our systems are still pretty much the same. There are a lot of new companies that have made their mark in terms of alternative proteins, plant-based, all that. That, of course, has taken place in the last 5 years. Do you feel like the acceleration is underway currently, or could and will this really happen within a 30-year timeline? That seems pretty short for being able to feed 10 billion people.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we have seen a lot of progress just over the past couple of years. At GFI, we pull retail sales data here in the United States using a service called SPINS, and we also look at food service data using a service called NPD. And the data from the past couple of years has shown double-digit growth. And I think, you know, it's important to also set the stage a little bit and say that the base is quite low. If you look at plant-based meat, so if you think of products like the Impossible Burger, Beyond Burger, and others, they still, as a category, only make up about 1% of meat in retail. But I think what's been really exciting is the dramatic growth of this sector. And you know, plant-based meat is still really small, but I think a great kind of case study is the industry of plant-based milk. So about 20 years ago, plant-based milk was where plant-based meat is today. And it really took a change in the way they merchandise plant-based milk. So moving it from those shelf-stable boxes in the middle of the grocery store where only vegans and vegetarians and people with food allergies would go hunt them down, to putting them merchandised in the dairy case. And really, that's now what we're seeing with plant-based meat. So whereas they used to be in a separate part of the grocery store that was kind of hard to find for mainstream consumers, now you're seeing a lot of these products being merchandised in the meat case. And because of that shift, we're expecting over the next 20 years, even the next 5 years, for plant-based meat to really grow very, very quickly, because it's no longer just focusing on vegans and vegetarians as the consumer base, but it's really focusing on all consumers, which is obviously the larger opportunity.
Yeah. The one thing that I found a difference when you look at dairy, poultry, the meat industry as a whole, when you look at plant-based compared to what's happening in the dairy and poultry, let's just say dairy and poultry for eggs and milk and so on, the traditional animal-based protein. And the difference is that even though there were a handful of brands that were somewhat recognizable, I mean, if you look back in the years ago, it was Borden's Milk, some of those kinds of things, those brands never really made it to what I think would be retail prowess, meaning it's something that you recognize like a Gatorade product. Much like what Beyond Meat has done. So Beyond Meat obviously has become the poster child for plant-based and alternative proteins, but they were very unusual in their sense of how they hit the market running, the right timing with plant-based going forward. I'm just kind of curious, won't it take a lot more of Beyond Meats to be able to get to any kind of critical mass to really affect the food system? Because 1%, just here in the United States, much less going into a third world country with that product's not even available. How do we get past that? Because these are some big problems that need to be solved over the next decade for us to see accelerated growth.
Yeah, 100%. So really that's why GFI exists, is actually to really help more companies like the Beyond Meats and Impossible Foods actually come to fruition. So, but I also think what's really exciting is that in addition to the startups that you mentioned that are really creating a lot of change, and the way they're doing that is actually by focusing on innovation. So really proving to consumers that they can make products that are as tasty, if not tastier, than animal meat by using all plant ingredients. But I think what's also exciting is looking at some of the larger food companies who have already extensive distribution in food service and retail and have a lot of the manufacturing capacity to be able to scale up quickly. So these are companies like Tyson, who launched their Raised and Rooted brand last year. Companies like Hormel, which have come to the market with Happy Little Plants. And of course, Kellogg's Morningstar, who not only have that brand, Morningstar Farms, that they've really focused on a lot of innovation on recently, but also their launch of a new brand called Incognito, which is really focusing on that true kind of meat-like mimicry. So I think given the major food companies, and also don't forget Smithfield, another meat company, which launched Pure Farmland, that will help the acceleration dramatically. But again, part of the work that we do at GFI is really help support entrepreneurs and startups because we do need more companies globally. So, and they're springing up left and right. I mean, it's a pretty exciting space to be in. We have a database of all the companies that are in the alternative protein space, and we're constantly adding to it. It feels like every day.
Yeah. So when you look at the areas of I guess categories, so to speak, for alternative and just meat disruptors out there, what are some of the ones that you guys collaborate with, and where do you see the most growth? Obviously, beyond the fact that we've got some plant-based burger guys that are starting to accelerate now. Any other categories that you think, hey, these are really good growth vehicles for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So, plant-based burgers make up the majority of the sales at this point, both in food service and in retail. And again, I think a lot of that was because consumers like things that are familiar, right? Although they are also interested sometimes in novel products, I think to appeal to the mass consumer base, most of the brands making these products wanted to come into the market with something that was familiar, something that consumers knew how to cook already. So I think now that that's pretty well established, although we still are seeing many more come onto the market in the burger category, we absolutely see that there is a huge white space opportunity for more chicken products. So while there are a fair amount of chicken patties and chicken nuggets, we still think that there's a lot of growth in that sector. Whole muscle meat is also something that some companies are working on. especially companies who are actually in the more in the fermentation space. So if you think about mycelium-based products, so there are a few
Right.
startups right now, that are focused on making things like, slab bacon and whole muscle chicken out of things like mycelium, which is a really sustainable way to make some of these
Interesting.
products. Also, there are a lot of crumbles right now, but we
Hmm.
haven't seen a lot in the way of pork products. And another real big white space opportunity is in seafood. So
Okay.
there are a couple brands. Gardein makes some fishless fillets. We have a startup called Good Catch, which actually makes a
Yep.
shelf-stable tuna product. But really, there is a lot of room for growth on the plant-based seafood front.
Yeah, we had the Good Catch CEO on our network, and phenomenal interview, great insights into where that market is going. Because a lot of times seafood is a very unusual portion of, because most people don't think of that as farmed animals. It's a different public perception. We had the Blue Nalu guy on to talk a little bit about how their cellular agriculture was shifting. And I'm kind of curious, when you look at cellular agriculture, because that's been one area that, to me, at least, I would say we're one of the few food networks that are really covering this on the front bleeding edge. And one thing that I have found is that they're very cagey about the science. And I don't know if that's because it's proprietary or if they're still in experimentation mode, but I can't quite get answers given to me when I get, like Memphis Meats, it's hard to get an interview with these guys. Blue Nalu, great interview, but dodges a lot of questions when it comes to cellular agriculture and its future of how muscle and cellular tissue can be affected with different kinds of implementations of how you grow it. So I'm kind of curious, you're right there behind the scenes. What are you hearing from these cellular agricultural guys?
We're hearing that there's a lot of progress being made. However, it's still early days.
Yeah.
So, I think what's really fascinating is if you look, we actually have a slide that we often use in our presentations that shows the growth of the cellular agriculture industry. We actually call it the cultivated meat industry, but there are many names, as you
Yep.
probably will know. But only 5 years ago, there were only, I think, 4 companies in the sector, including
Hmm.
Memphis Meats and Mosa Meats and a few
Right.
others. Now, if you look at the slide, there are over 60 companies globally.
Wow.
So, and it's really interesting because not all of them are focusing on the B2C market. A lot
Hmm.
of them are actually focusing on B2B. So, for
Sure.
example, only focusing on making cellular fat, which they would then use to potentially sell to makers of plant-based products, because fat is one of the challenges, right?
You
Making a
bet. Yeah.
plant-based product that really mimics animal fat. It could also be that they're going to provide, cellular fat to a company that's just making the muscle tissue. And there are many other examples. Some companies are just focusing on the cell culture media, for example. So I think, a lot of the reason for the quote secrecy is that some of these companies are still really at bench stage. Some of them, a few of them, are getting to pilot stage, but it still is really early days. And obviously, the regulatory path is an absolute challenge globally for this whole sector as well. It's very
Right.
encouraging from our perspective that the USDA and the FDA have already jointly agreed to regulate this industry.
That's good.
But again, in other countries, we want to make sure that there's a fair, a level playing field for this industry to come to market.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like we as, and I say we, meaning the United States, are advanced enough in this technology and in the, kind of the manufacturing scalability of this? I know that we have a lot of, meat manufacturers here when you look at the growth of companies like Tyson and so on. Hormel, I've been to their plants. And that's plenty of production scalability. But within the area of someone like a Beyond Meat, when you go out to Ethan's place, that's a different kind of facility altogether. So, and I haven't seen too many of those. So I'm kind of curious, is the US ahead of the curve or are we behind the curve when you look at a global industry around plant-based or alternative production facilities? Are we kind of up to where the rest of the world is?
Yeah, I think the US and Europe are definitely leading the way as far as production capacity. That's not to say that there's not a lot of room for improvement. One of the areas that we focus on is really looking at the full supply chain at
Yeah.
GFI. So
Yeah.
literally from farm to shelf. And we try to look upstream to really identify what the barriers are and opportunities. And really, one of the big barriers is the amount of manufacturing space. And so, if you're looking at just the plant-based side, a lot of companies use co-manufacturers, and there's a
Right.
limited number of these, not only in the U.S. but also in Europe. And we see that as a huge, business opportunity. And part of our work is actually approaching companies who are not in this space but have the manufacturing capacity to
Right.
see if this is something that they would be interested in. A lot of these products use very expensive extruders. These are sometimes $1 million pieces of machinery,
Yeah.
and that's a big capital investment for a startup. So manufacturing capacity is definitely a challenge. Even if Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are having a lot of trouble meeting demand, but in order for them to create a whole new factory, that takes years.
Yeah.
So we definitely see that that's something that we'd like to see more focus on by both investors as well as companies in the space.
That's a very interesting point you make, because that's kind of the scenario we've been in here with COVID, is that when there was a hint of potential meat shortages, it was because of the co-pack or the packers and the houses, the prep houses, we'll call them, weren't operational. So it pretty much kind of stalled a lot of that distribution line. I could see this happening in the alternative manufacturing side if you don't have enough co-packers in the future, just in general. Co-packers being, something, as you had mentioned, kind of far and few between. Is there a lot of, I guess my question is, do you see traditional companies kind of splintering off to offer co-packing for these emerging companies that are coming up the ranks to be able to get their products out there fast enough to be able to, again, make a dent in a large population for food?
Yeah, I think some of the large CPG companies are absolutely trying to figure out where they can produce their products, because they may not have the capacity in their existing facilities. So
Right.
I definitely think that that's the case. I mean, I think the beauty of the manufacturing facilities versus, say, a slaughterhouse for the animal meat industry is that they require far fewer people on the floor. And so I think
Okay.
while we did
Much more
see
automation.
much
Yeah.
more automation. I know that, some of the manufacturing facilities that make plant-based products were impacted slightly, but not to the extent that we saw, with companies in the meat space.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so moving on to when you look at the commercial opportunities of this industry, and I shouldn't say the industry, but just the movement of food tech in general, especially food stores and grocery stores that, even though most mainliners like a Publix or a Whole Foods, if you go up on the higher end, seem to be the traditional methods of distribution, but there is kind of an explosion of a lot of this direct-to-consumer product. Do you feel like those are kind of the commercial opportunities that are out there, or what do you see in the future of some of these companies being able to go to market very fast?
Yeah, I definitely think that e-commerce is definitely a good angle. I think meal kits represent a great possibility, and I know some companies are taking advantage of that. Obviously, as you well know, the food service industry has been hit quite dramatically,
Yes.
and that is actually traditionally how a lot of these plant-based products came to market. If you look at Impossible Foods, for example, that was their go-to-market strategy. So but I think, seeing how the retail sector is still booming, and, if you look at year-over-year increases of some of the plant-based products, we're still seeing double-digit increases versus a year ago. During the stage back in March and April, when consumers were hoarding, we were seeing
Hmm.
triple-digit increases. So we still think retail is a great way for some of these companies to go to market. And I think, again, as the merchandising of these products changes, which is what a lot of retailers are starting to do, that's really going to create benefits for both the companies selling them as well as the retailers. The current consumers of plant-based products tend to have higher average shopping cart sizes than
Right.
regular consumers, so that's a real
Hmm.
benefit. I don't know if you've heard about the new study that just came out that Kroger and the PBFA, the Plant-Based Foods Association,
Just saw
conducted.
it. Yep.
Yeah, so it's pretty exciting. I mean, they showed that when these products are merchandised in the meat counter, sales went up overall across 3 different markets by 23%, which is
Yeah.
pretty significant.
Do you, I guess the question, this would be an interesting thing. Do you feel like the meat organizations out there are going to really push back against that to try to, position politically to get the plant-based products out of the meat aisle, or at least not call it meat?
Well, again, I think, as we see some of them, so we see Hormel and Smithfield and Tyson all involved in this space. In some ways, it's to their benefit, right, that the
Right.
sales increase. So companies like Purdue, they currently only have a blended product, but that's another opportunity for a lot of these companies is
Yep.
producing products that might be 50 or 60% meat and the rest vegetable. Another opportunity I also wanted to mention is I think for some of the companies making plant-based foods, institutional food service is a huge opportunity. Again, it's been impacted dramatically, especially when you
Yeah.
think about say corporate cafeterias and whatnot. K through 12, so hopefully kids are going back to school and there will continue to be food service there. But I think long term, colleges and universities represent a huge opportunity for a lot of these products. And then the other area is in ingredient replacement. Right.
Yeah.
So right now you have a lot of, say frozen meals that might use animal ingredients. And a lot of those companies are really trying to capitalize on this shift to plant-based eating. And so they could be looking for things like plant-based egg and dairy and meat as ingredients. I think a great company that's doing this really well is ConAgra. So through their Gardein line,
Right.
they have actually been using the Gardein ingredients in some of their other brands. So that's been a really interesting kind of cross promotion that we've seen.
Yeah, I've been impressed with the food service suppliers really taking charge. And obviously the writing, I think, is on the wall for them in the sense of they need to look at some alternative distribution products and alternative channels out there. So I definitely see that being a kind of a growth. When you look at that in terms of the growth of the industry, again, it's getting very wide. It's no longer, beef, pork, chicken, that kind of thing. It's really starting to create some huge alternative choices. So there's going to be some market leaders, everything from pea protein people, the lentil guys, the pure vegetable burger products versus the processed alternative beef products. How do you see this shaking out in terms of the growth markets? Because it seems to me like there could be hundreds of categories coming to market all at once.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think, when we look at the different categories, so at GFI, the way we define plant-based foods is they're basically products that are replacing an animal product. So we wouldn't count kale or quinoa, for example, as being a plant-based food. So we've divided it into, I think it's 7 different categories. So plant-based milk and meat and plant-based eggs, et cetera. And I think, one of the categories that has the highest growth rate right now is actually plant-based egg, but there aren't that many products on the market. So I do
Right.
actually think that is one of the sectors that we'll see explode with new options. But I also think, plant-based cheese has a lot of room for innovation. I think, the meltability, the real functionality of the plant-based
Right.
cheeses, definitely have some room to go. But a lot of companies are indeed focusing on this. So I think you're right in that, I think all of the sectors really have room to grow. If you look at plant-based meat as only having 1% market share, that's showing you that there's still a lot of
Huge market. Yeah.
huge market.
Yeah.
And right now, the growth that we're seeing in plant-based meat is in the refrigerated section. And I think a lot of that is, consumers kind of perceive, a refrigerated product as being more fresh. And it also could be that when they're shopping for animal meat, they then see the plant-based meat and, basically say, oh, I'd actually like to eat a little bit healthier tonight. So maybe that's why they choose it. But I think we'll start seeing more and more products come out in the refrigerated section since that seems to be where the growth is. But you're also absolutely right in that there are all kinds of consumers. Like a lot of times we'll get asked the question, who are the consumers for these products, and the answer is everyone.
Yeah.
And people have different motivations. And, while some people are really always going to go for the products that are truly mimicking meat, and that's,
Yeah.
those are the organoleptic properties they're looking for, products that taste like meat and cook like meat and smell like meat and look like meat. Other consumers are going to be totally turned off by that. And they're going to want to go towards more of what we call the non-analog products, or the products that might be highlighting the vegetables or the grains, things that
Yeah.
maybe have a cleaner label. So I do think, the spectrum of products is very wide, and it will continue to be populated with products with different benefits.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting to see markets start to open that are really focused in on all of the. There's just so many products coming into the marketplace now that's you could literally build a store on it. Especially when you look at companies like Thrive, who have kind of done just that. All right, so let's talk about last few minutes. I just got a couple of questions, or just one question last. If I'm out there, I've got a great new food tech, and I'm thinking here, I've got to get to market. Maybe or joining your organization. What are some of the little things that I need to be doing to prep my business to kind of get to that next step?
Well, I would first reach out to the Good Food Institute. There are a lot of services that we can provide to help startups as well as large food companies. So we provide really no-cost advising to all companies. And we have a pretty active community called GF Ideas, which is for entrepreneurs and startups.
Okay.
We have a lot of resources on basically how to get your market, or how to get your product rather, into market. So information about distribution, et cetera. So, it's a complicated process, I think,
Yeah.
to get into the retail space. So you have to understand, the distributors and the redistributors. I
Yeah.
think, prior to COVID, it was a lot maybe easier to try to, you had several different distribution models to choose from, with food service being one of the major ones. And
Right.
now that that's been hampered quite a bit, really, it's all about retail. But, our hope is that food service is going to come back. So I think, startups and entrepreneurs need to be focusing on all avenues of distribution, and really coming up with a game plan for how to do that in the most effective and efficient way. And we're happy to help.
Yeah, good to see that you guys are going in that direction. You guys also look at, do you have education available for things like packaging, getting, kind of the packaging design process, that whole scenario, especially if you look into retail, that becomes such a factor in being able to sell the product.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, while we're not a branding agency, we absolutely can use some of the primary and secondary research that we have on consumer, motivations, as well as what language is most effective.
Right.
So just a good example of that is, there now has actually been a fair amount of research on whether vegan is the right term to kind of put forward as a way to market products. And I think while there are exceptions, for the most part, it does seem like vegan is associated more with a lifestyle than a kind of food, whereas plant-based tends to be,
yeah.
again, more associated with food rather than a lifestyle. So, in the research that we have done, plant-based, plant-forward, plant protein are all real positive sounding terms. So we're absolutely happy to help advise on subtle things like that, or not so subtle,
Excellent.
for that matter.
It sounds like you guys get your hands full there. So with the number of companies that are going on, and I guess just the number of business challenges that kind of face us today, especially with where COVID is, distribution channels, co-packing issues, packaging, probably legislative in some sort, getting in through the FDA, all those kind of things. It looks like people need to stay pretty close to what you guys are doing. So for all of you guys listening out there, Good Food Institute, thank you, Alison, for stopping in on the session today. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
For sure. All right, all you guys listening in right now, watching over here on the live stream, or maybe you're catching this on demand after, make sure and just hit the bubble down on the lower right. It's your lower right, my lower left. But that's for your Q&A to be able to talk and get some answers from each of our guests throughout the day. Here on FoodTech21, and of course, that's the best interaction. And you can always hit foodabletv.com to get more information, and of course, foodable.io, which is where all of our virtual events are housed and come from. So it's great having you. We'll catch you on the next session right here.